On March 13th, 2026, EDHREC.com, one of the most popular sites for discussion and data on Magic the Gathering's Commander format, posted an article entitled Nothing Without Us: Accessibility, Advocacy, and Magic. This article was about an interview with Alexander Nathan, founder of Permastunned Gaming, to get information from him about his experiences playing Magic the Gathering as a disability advocate with congenital myopathy, which is a progressive congenital muscle disease. Alexander Nathan discussed his love for the game, but also his frustration with inaccessible spaces that he had to face to keep playing. In his home of Limburg in the Netherlands, none of his local game stores were wheelchair accessible. Nathan went on to state that this lack of accessibility means disabled players face the greatest obstacles right when they are trying to enter competitive play. Larger events tends to be more accommodating, but then travel becomes the problem, particularly when accessible hotels are limited. These are not issues that a company like Wizards of the Coast can solve on its own. It takes a broader community effort, and it becomes even more complicated when governments fail to uphold accessibility commitments. I have been playing Magic the Gathering since 2017. I have fallen in love with the game, and even better, I have loved being a part of a community of welcoming, understanding people. All of the local game stores I have attended have been places where I've felt respected, and more importantly, where friends and strangers, who are people of color or members of the LGBTQI+ community, are also respected. However, people like Alexander Nathan expose the failings of that community. It is very easy for someone not disabled like myself to be ignorant towards inaccessibility. Disability is often overlooked in conversations about diversity, and gaming culture is hardly known for being perfectly united on inclusivity when it comes to more vocal and well-supported groups like women or black and brown people. However, none of these admissions absolve us of the responsibility to work harder. This is why I am making this video essay on accessibility in Magic the Gathering. If you are a member of the disability and Magic the Gathering communities, and you find this video, then I am so excited to have you here, and I would be honored if you would take the time to engage with it, and even more so if you are willing to comment about your own thoughts and experiences afterwards. As I stated before, I do not consider myself to be a member of the disability community. The boundaries of that identity, like with most social categories, are nebulous and can be deeply personal. Some people might argue that I actually do count as disabled, because I was diagnosed with ADHD and asthma as a child, and I wear glasses because my vision is imperfect. However, I grew up with enough financial and social privilege due to my status as a white, cisgender, straight man that I don't currently accept that label for myself. Disability is often considered a minority issue, but in fact, a great plurality of people will experience disability at some point in their life. Age, illness, injuries, pregnancy, and many other life events all can cause temporary or permanent disability. I say all this to frame your perspective of who is writing the script and editing this video, and assert that, while nuance and fluidity are core aspects of the disabled experience, the voice you are currently listening to is an ally and a relatively uneducated one at that. That is why, in order to avoid errors and misinformation, I reached out to more qualified voices in this field.
I'm Katie. I am a disability historian starting my PhD at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. I study disability in the 20th century mostly. I delve a little bit into the 21st century, which tends to be where people stop believing that it's history, and a little bit into the post-Civil War period, which is what I'm intending to write my PhD dissertation on. Um, I post TikToks at Katie the Historian. Um, I post personally on Instagram, which is my full name, Catherine Greenstein. Um, I also sometimes write for myself and for various history publications when I eventually get things published. So sometimes you see my name pop up here and there. I've been doing disability advocacy as a disabled person for most of my life in some shape or another. I have multiple chronic illnesses and have generally been involved in community organizations related to those illnesses as a part of my life. Um, but I really got involved in college when I founded my university's Disabled Student Union. Um, and from there, I think I just continued to be more and more involved, being involved in campus issues, being involved in national issues. I think kind of just comes naturally to me, and staying involved as a part of history practice is really important to me. And so part of that is, how do I maintain a relationship to the community that I study? Part of it is convenient because I'm also a member of this community. And so there's some kind of relational rapport that I have with a lot of people who I'm working with. They know that I'm also disabled. So it's a little easier to trust me versus someone coming into the community to study them kind of as an outsider. But part of why I get a lot of trust and faith as a historian is because I'm on the ground with them. And so, like, I'm the chair of the Disability Alumni Organization at my undergrad institution, which was also where I got my master's. Um, I am the person who a lot of people call to talk about disability stuff. I speak on panels about disability. I am the first person from my university to get a disability studies minor, which is really cool. Um, and I think remaining involved in that way um, really informs my historical practice and kind of helps me remain in the community. So helps me stay not out of touch. And yeah, that's kind of what I've been up to.
Some members of our community actively seek to bridge this gap in support via spreading awareness or through tremendous efforts of creative design. Lucas Ray Deli posted a video on their YouTube channel in 2021 discussing how to make Magic more accessible to blind and visually impaired gamers. Their video received very positive encouragement from the comments section, with several viewers expressing their own accessibility wishes for the game, whether for themselves or friends and family they wished to play with but currently had no means to do so due to a lack of proper accessibility tools. I could find no acknowledgement from the Magic Arena team or anyone at Wizards of the Coast that they saw this video, or really any acknowledgement of these kinds of repeated fan requests for greater accessibility. It would take the work of a fellow fan to achieve, in part, what Lucas Ridelli was pushing for. Just this past year, GitHub user Gene Stiletto modded a built-in screen reader to Magic the Gathering Arena. While this is based as fuck, it should not be the responsibility of individual members of the Magic community to make sure a digital client has accessibility features for those with visual disabilities. It is on Wizards of the Coast to pay its employees to create and support these services. Now, companies love to argue that the expenses of implementing accessibility features are just far too great to be profitable. To that I say, A, fuck you, do it anyway. B, actually, Wizards of the Coast has been the only profitable section of Hasbro's intellectual property for multiple years. The rest of Hasbro is essentially an endless money pit, perfectly content to pay its executives massive bonuses and rake in record profits while conducting mass layoffs right before the winter holiday season. So fuck you, do it anyway. C, in almost every instance of a company, government, or organization spending the time and money to build accessibility tools, the results benefit everyone, not just the minority of people who pushed for the tools in the first place. The most common example of this is curb cuts, which are those ramps you see in crosswalks with tactile segments on them. Any sidewalk with a steep drop-off onto the road is a hazard and an obstacle for pedestrians using wheelchairs or blind pedestrians. However, when an incline or ramp replaces a step on the sidewalk, then it also means parents pushing a stroller can walk easier. Elderly people have an easier time walking without stressing their legs, stepping up or down. Delivery workers can push a cart of boxes without having to lift it up. All parties benefit through improvements to accessibility.
I don't think people necessarily automatically make that association with gaming, but having an option to increase contrast, have captions, make it so that there's not flashing lights. These things are really beneficial, and they increase access for people who have migraines, who might be deaf or hard of hearing. I just get distracted and I want to be able to read it instead of hear it, so like me. And yeah, I think in general, like, these are things that help a lot more people than people who know that they're disabled, know that these are things that they need. There's kind of a greater audience base for some of these accessibility tools.
Gene Stiletto's sight readings tool for Arena might have been designed first and foremost for players with disabilities, but it seems likely to improve the gameplay experience for elderly players, younger players who are still learning to read, and many others. So to conclude, fuck you, do it anyway. Despite these very compelling counter-arguments I just launched at Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, I have the strangest feeling they will disagree and continue ignoring the disabled Magic player base. This is because Wizards of the Coast does not actually have to answer to their customers, they have to answer to their shareholders. As I stated earlier, Hasbro isn't doing very well, so they have to put a lot of pressure on Wizards of the Coast to do better, earn more money, bring in more players, each and every financial quarter. And when told the risk is alienating the player base, WotC often waves away these concerns because, well, they're making money right now, and as long as the numbers go up, then clearly it'll keep going up forever, right? Individual players alienated from the game, or players who find the game too inaccessible to try at all, are data points that can be largely ignored in favor of total profits and sales numbers. These numbers, by the way, players continuously debate the accuracy of, because, on top of everything else, Wizards of the Coast is not obligated to share their actual financial models and statistics with us, the players. That information is, once again, for the shareholders. Our investment in the game with our hard-earned money, our time, our community, and for the case of individuals like Gene Stiletto on GitHub, hours upon hours of labor to make a game they love more accessible, are ultimately not fundamental to Wizards of the Coast's assessment of their own game. So is there no hope of change? Of course not. Individual action may not break through the bubble that Hasbro has sheltered itself within, but that is where collective action enters the conversation. Boycotts, protests, unofficial mods, piracy, and switching to competition are all tools at the disposal of the consumer, but no collective action is more immediately threatening to an obstinate corporation than unionization. In the middle of the creation of this video, game developers working for Magic the Gathering Arena announced that they were organizing a union. The mission of this burgeoning union is to establish better working conditions for all workers at the company. This is a huge deal. At the time of recording, Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro have refused to recognize the union. This is unsurprising, but the union has not backed down, stating they will continue to negotiate for recognition and meeting their demands. And I'm so glad we took a while to organize this call because the Arena staff just unionized. They are trying to get recognition from the company for that union. This, of course, as we've said, doesn't solve one of the primary issues of how to make the paper game more accessible, but millions of people play on Arena. It is by far the most, typically easy to get into way to play Magic. You can, get it on almost every type of computer software, iPads, iPhones, all sorts of things like that. So that's a really big step. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of labor movements and how they've intersected with letting people who are either, working disabled workers in those unions or just their families and, dependents and people like that, how do those goals usually align themselves or lack the ability to align?
Yeah, I'll say there's kind of two split histories I'll mention here. One is that labor movements are critical to acquiring the rights of their workers. Often those workers have disabilities, are going to have disabilities, and labor movements are critical to securing those people's rights. Workers' comp is a disability issue. If you are injured on the job, you are often either temporarily or permanently disabled. And so the right to workers' comp is an acquired disability issue. So many of the things that labor unions are fighting for are at their core related to disability, if not straight up disability issues. The rights to a weekend, to only work an 8-hour workday. And now we're of course expanding on these things, but the history of a union at its core to be able to be paid enough money to be able to have health care as a benefit, dental, vision, all of these things are things that we got because of unions. And so the extensive history of unions requesting things from employers, almost all of them are, in my opinion, connected in some way or the other, kind of generally. I won't say specific unions, because every so often they mention something and I'm like, I've never heard of that before and it has nothing to do with me.
Right.
Um, but, maybe there's some rare carpentry issue that doesn't really have anything to do with us. But um, a lot of the general workers' rights issues that unions kind of generally advocate for, the AFL-CIO, that type of thing. Um, Reasonable hours, good benefits, good pay, and if something, God forbid, happens on your work site, to be able to be compensated for it. These are all things that affect us, because a lot of the workers that need those benefits come out of work disabled. And so there's kind of that history. The other half of it, is that the history of disability rights wouldn't exist without unions. In the 1970s, which we're filming this in the anniversary period of,
Oh, really?
back in 1977 in April, there was a massive 26-day sit-in in San Francisco mostly, but in other federal buildings as well, over the enforcement of Section 504, which was at the time the predominant civil rights legislation for disabled people. Now, the ADA comes after, and we've gained some more stuff. But at the time, this was really groundbreaking. It meant that federal programs and programs that receive federal funding, so keyword schools, needed to be able to make sure that they were accessible or could provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities. And these were signed into law back in 1973. But in order to enforce them, the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now Health and Human Services, HHS.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's too many acronyms in Washington, D.C.
So
But HHS, which was previously called HEW, they needed to release regulations on how to enforce this law. And so they just hadn't done it. And it's 1977, and Jimmy Carter has just been sworn in as president. And Carter's campaign ran on this being a policy issue. We were going to write those regulations on day one, we were going to sign them in, and it would be no problem. And he didn't do that. Which because I just told you it was April. But April comes, and large groups of disabled people who had gotten to know each other through various, organizations were like, fuck this, man, and started a protest outside of originally, and then sitting in on several government buildings in the United States. There were originally 10, and then they eventually came into 50 UN Plaza in San Francisco as the main one. Eventually, a delegation of them would need to go to Washington, D.C. to negotiate with HEW. They were transported by the International Association of Machinists because at the time, transit wasn't particularly accessible because the ADA hadn't passed and 504 didn't have any regulation.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is this massive moment in history where our ability to get our civil rights depended on the efforts of labor unions. Now, they were not the only people who provided support. The Black Panther Party came in and provided food and also low-key intimidated the FBI for us. We had support from lesbian organizations, gay men's organizations, churches, politicians. There were a ton of people there. But what stands out to me is that labor and disability are not just intertwined on the labor side. Labor unions showed up for us when we needed it the most. And they have continued to recognize that our issues are their issues, because so many of their guys, and I'm using guys in a gender neutral way, so many of their people are our people. And that's both with acquired and congenital disabilities, because disabled people got to go to work after 504, and then even more after the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And the disabled employment rate has been going up. Obviously, it kind of reflects the trends of the greater economy, but generally has been going up since the 70s. And they know that we need the same protections that they do. So there's kind of those two separate histories, but it's always nice to hear that another kind of industry has had an opportunity to unionize, because those creative industries are where a lot of disabled people find their work because it's more accommodating.
In an inverse to the effect of accessibility tools we discussed earlier, a workers' union that affords greater benefits to all union members through greater employee benefits, pay raises, protections against layoffs, and more are all ideas popular among laborers. But these union efforts might incidentally shield workers with disabilities from specific targeting by their employers, and the more secure access to healthcare benefits and practiced union solidarity allow a framework for disabled workers to demand accessible working conditions with better chances of success. If you have not yet publicly supported the Arena Union, I highly encourage you to do so. It may not be the typical thing that Magic players spend their time discussing at their game table, but this is seriously one of the biggest news stories affecting our game in years. If the Arena Union is successful at forcing Wizards of the Coast to meet their demands, then in the next few years, Arena might finally get official versions of the tools so far to be found only in player-made mods. Also consider checking if your local stores that sell Magic cards have a union. Big box retail stores like Walmart and Target often employ union busting tactics, and some of you might have heard the story from last year that TCG Player, one of the most popular sites for trading and buying Magic cards, owned by eBay, shut down its warehouse in Syracuse, New York, rather than see its workers form a union. If you are a worker at such a location, look up your state's labor rights laws and talk to your fellow workers about how you can improve conditions at your work site, including accessibility. If you are just a player, always buy your cards from stores that pay their workers a good wage, support the player community instead of exploiting it, and just generally aren't petty, greedy assholes. We've now discussed actions as an individual consumer and collective actions, but there is a middle point worth bringing up, and that is the miniature communities that form around us while actively playing the game. Friends gather around kitchen tables, strangers sitting down across convention tables to compete, students pushing desks together for club activities after school, and new players learning the game from older siblings, cousins, and parents on the carpeted floor of their bedroom. No matter how much Hasbro, and to a lesser extent local game stores, try to monopolize control and authority over the act of play, within these spaces, we hold dominion. Therefore, acts of creativity and labor, like the mod work of Gene Stiletto on GitHub, will be necessary to make gaming a more inclusive, accessible space. For example, Wizards of the Coast used to make oversized legendary creature cards included in their pre-constructed commander decks. This product has since been discontinued, but the concept, which was always seen by most fans as a superficial bonus, actually held great potential for readability. How many times nowadays do you sit across the table from your friends and groan at the wall of text printed on their new commander? If you have a deck that runs a commander with an oversized card, consider picking up that version if it is financially available to you. It might go a long way towards improving your next game night. For the majority of legendary creatures that never got the oversized card treatment, consider printing out a proxy on a normal piece of 8x11 printer paper. Heck, print out 3 more copies, so that way you can hand them out to all of your opponents to read whenever they need a refresher on what your commander does. I myself also tends to build my commander decks around 2 to 3 mechanics, like a deck I recently built that focuses on cycling and finality counters. I printed out a cheat sheet of all the relevant rules for those mechanics and brought it with me, because I intended to use the deck to teach a friend of mine to play with it. But that cheat sheet could also work really well for allowing your opponents to focus less on remembering the minute details of how mechanics work, and instead actually get to the interesting decisions of play and how to stop your game plan on a fair and equal basis. These are just some of the ideas I came up with to strengthen accessibility at your next Magic the Gathering game table. If you have any tools you've designed or stories of how you formed an accessible gaming community, I would love it if you shared your experiences in the comments of this video.
Part of all of this is like informing the public that this is an issue, and then the public continuing to talk about it. It doesn't matter if you're disabled or not. It doesn't matter if you've ever been disabled. It doesn't matter if you know someone who's disabled. It's why I would continue to encourage you to like talk to people in gaming stores if you see something that's inaccessible. It's why I would encourage you to like continue to raise hell in public if you see something that looks inaccessible to ask. It's why I would encourage you to make a stink about disability representation in something. Because if you don't see a disabled person, they have written disabled people out of that instance of reality. Disabled people are everywhere. Spoiler. They've always been everywhere. There is not a time in history where disabled people have not been there. And so to write us out of reality is ahistorical. Obviously, this is a fantasy world, but fantasizing about a universe where disabled people aren't there is weird. But like I really think that a lot of this is about um, trying to cure. And I lost like my original
Hmm.
where I was gonna end on this
Yeah.
brain fog. um, but like we are trying to generate a representative and engaging world, and it is our obligation, disabled or not, to like say something in the same sense that like I, a white person, if I saw something that was like visibly racist in a gaming store, I'd be like, I don't really think I don't think you should have that out in this gaming store
Yeah.
because it's still racist, regardless of if I'm a white person or not.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's about like what is in our material reality. And if the material reality is that like this store is inaccessible, this game is not representative, like we should be raising hell regardless.
Please support the Magic Arena Union team, Alexander Nathan and his esports group Permastunt Gaming, and all of the other awesome creators featured throughout this video. A very, very special thank you to Katie Greenstein, without whom this video would not have been possible. And finally, thank you, the viewer, for watching this video. And as Katie said, go raise some hell.